Thank you all for being here. Court governance, that's why we're here. And the core. Before we get into it, I have the honor of kind of explaining what the core means. How many people know about the core? So I got like 3/4 of the room. So the core is actually competencies that NACM developed years ago, and there are some people in the audience that actually developed the original, and what was it, back in, I don't remember what year. Somebody shout out a year that it was worked on originally. It was over 20 years ago, 1990. So the core has been around for a while, and what are they? Their core principles court administrators need to know in order to do their job. So we have 13 core competencies, and they're grouped into 3 modules: vision, principle, and practice. Today we're going to be in that vision module about court governance, but also in that you got leadership, you've got strategic planning for vision, and then the principle is that the base: public trust and confidence, purposes and responsibilities, and practices are all the more hands-on: court ops, workforce management, those types of things. So what we're excited about is, that's our educational component. There's resource materials in online, but also on our website at nacmcore.org. But we recently, in 2021, rolled out the Core Champion program. So this class being recorded, you can go and watch it afterwards. Once you've taken it, you can answer some structured responses for the class and get credit for it. And there's a certificate program. So we're going to want to walk you through that and give you that opportunity and explain it. But why did we create it? We wanted you to have some takeaways from the program. We want to strengthen our court profession, give you information, give you some tangible, more exposure to the core. And we want to have these sessions at every conference. We're also developing a little more online presence as well. And then afterwards, you get a certificate for attending the program. And these are the certificates, so you can get up to 5 of them. So if you're a certificate person and you love that affirmation, that's great, but it's also something that you can take back to your courts. This is what I learned. So there's 5. There's the different ones that you can get. If you take something from each module, you get a certificate. If you complete an entire module, you get a certificate. And then if you go through all 13, you get the Core Champion certificate at the end. How to get the certificate? You have to attend this session, and then again, answer some structured responses about the session, and then turn it into NACM, and then you get graded on it, and then we start collecting all the information about all the sessions that you've attended. Once you get to all 13, then we're going to ask if you want that final certificate. It's just not a sign-off. We do expect some type of essay or article. Basically, what did you learn? How are you applying all the core core competencies? And then you get your certificate, you get acknowledged at a conference. So any questions? We have, our website is nacmcore.org, and I think the structured responses are in your app, so after the session you can go in, click, and answer those questions, and then it'll also tell you where to email your responses back to. Okay, so that was my public service announcement for the core program. And if you have any questions about it, see any board member, anybody that has a NACM board flag on their lanyard, and we'd be happy to talk to you about it ad nauseum of this program. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Marcus to get us started on why we're all here.
And why are we here? Yeah, I'm just gratified to see this kind of turnout. It's just terrific. Tina, thank you, and thanks, folks, for the introductions. I can't believe we have this many people here for this class, and Janet should not be here. She knows too much, right? And maybe likewise with Don, but this is really actually an important kind of a topic, and the challenge for us is it should be about 3 days, I think, right? And we're going to try to cover this in about 40 minutes. And we do want to make this interactive, so I would urge you to jump in, likewise for the folks online. I was involved just, I guess this past year, Tina asked me to kind of help out to review the core. And I want to let you know that NACM is actually looking at every one of these, doing very kind of current updates, and it's really worthwhile. So NACM board, thank you for all that effort. But what struck me as I went through it, yeah, it's dated, but it's still as relevant as ever. When I think about the issues we heard from the keynote speaker, wasn't that interesting? You think about access to justice, equity, racial justice, and the like. And this core really goes to all those kind of issues. And so I urge you folks, when you finish the class, maybe take a look at the actual document, okay? And maybe even take it back and use with your management team. I think it could be really helpful. One thing we did was, Tina and I go both in preparation. You all know this publication? Sort of, kind of. This is terrific. And as we went through, these are actually the job functions of a court manager, if you will, whether it's an administrator, a clerk of court, deputy administrator, and also our ethics code. And what was funny is we looked at this, every one of these functions draws on governance, right? You have to have some kind of guiding true north, okay, to kind of accomplish the work in this document. So I'll pass this around just because I think it's such a terrific document. And if I was bringing this back to the office, that might be something you have at the table there. So let's get going here. And I've got my idea of governance. What does it mean? But I wanted to ask you folks, just what is this all about, and why is it so important? And anybody want to just chime in? And there's no right or wrong answers, but what is governance to you folks? Managing judges. It's okay to have some humor too, okay? Thank you. Yeah. In my experience, they're always managing me, you know, but Sharon, or Cheryl, excuse me. Yeah,
having a predictable way to be able to make decisions in your court, to be fair and consistent in reaching your vision.
Yeah, very well. Did everybody catch that? A predictable way to make decisions in the court, okay? So folks would understand the decisions. Thanks, Cheryl. Maybe somebody else jump in, please.
Style of leadership.
Tell us a little more, please.
I said style of leadership.
Yes.
I didn't prepare for that one.
No. But I think it does go to leadership, and it's very much a part of that. We talked about strategic planning, leadership, and the governance part of it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it goes to show, you know, the administration in position, what style of governance or leadership that they have, that they're ruling with, you know, kind of.
Well said. Yeah. Thank you. Absolutely. We'll take just one more and then we'll move along. Go ahead, please.
I think it's an outline of authorities and responsibilities.
Did folks catch that? So it's an outline, okay, of authority and responsibilities when it comes to all this decision making every day, right? And I'm afraid that Cheryl read my slides, okay? Because here's kind of, if you were to kind of look at it in the materials there, they're going to talk about that kind of daily day operations where all these decisions are made, right? First thing in the morning, the phones are ringing, you've got the help desk and so on. All day long we make decisions, and you're trying to make sound decisions that make sense, that are in alignment with the court's strategic plan and kind of the purpose and mission of courts, if you will. Kind of consistency, right? And this is especially important, I think, when you have a big change in leadership, a new presiding judge, a new administrator come in, and everybody's kind of nervous, right? And so how are we going to decide about resources? How do we make decisions about the budget? And so if you have good governance, that's going to be predictable and credible and whatnot. And you want this to be transparent so everybody knows, well, you know, how was that decision made in the back room, if you will. And then we also want to have some outside input. And so to me, that would be court tools, the surveys we do. Maybe it's the juror exit survey. It might be some focus groups. I know Minnesota's used a lot of focus groups as they talked about remote court hearings and whatnot to find out the sentiment. But that can sort of help inform that decision making. And then if the courts are running well, they will have judicial independence, right? When we kind of falter, that's when you will find the executive branch come in or the legislature to kind of manage us. But if we have good decision making inside the court, that's going to be recognized. And in turn, then, hopefully we have good public trust and confidence, right? We can only hope. A lot of learning objectives. I'm not going to read these to you. If I had to look at one, it would be number 4, okay? Because as we finish today, we're going to share with you some tools that you could use back at your home court when it comes to an assessment to kind of figure out how are we doing with this decision making day to day, right? Is it credible? Is it really working? could we make some tweaks that would make improvement there? So that, I was hoping maybe if we have time today, we can talk about that and maybe how you would use that. I'd love to hear if some of you have done that kind of work. I know that the National Center now has the high performance court framework, and we can kind of talk about those kind of tools there. Anybody want a history lesson this morning? Okay, I'm going to give you 100 years of history just real quick, like if that's okay. And then we'll kind of talk about it. So this guy, everybody remembers Roscoe Pound? What an interesting guy, a botanist by education and training, okay, but he becomes the dean of a law school, passed the bar, by the way, without going to law school. So, but he was kind of a real critic of courts and court operations. And if you read his materials, a lot of it will talk about backlog and delay, okay? Does that sound familiar? Those kind of problems. But he also talked a lot about court structure. He said, you've got a lot of duplication in these small local courts. You've got a lot of fragmentation. The public is confused, right? And so it was, in a way, kind of a call to arms to say we really do need to be organized, not just in public service, but how we actually operate these courts. So that's a terrific speech if you have time to just read that. It's so timely all these years later. Fast forward, and you see this huge proliferation of court institutions and court improvement organizations in the 70s and 80s. That's kind of when I started being the oldest person here, if you will. And it was Chief Justice Berger at that time, he actually said, we have more trained astronauts than we do court managers, right? Now, I'm not sure if that was exactly accurate, but it gave rise then to ICM, the Institute for Court Management, the National Center, Judicial College, you think also the American Judges Group, the Judicature Society, all those court improvement efforts came out as a result. And then we also started to see work along the way of standards and kind of guidelines that would kind of help the courts with the decision making day to day. And so you folks are aware, I think, of the time standards, the trial court performance standards, jury standards. The American Bar did two really important publications there, one on court organization and then another on court administration. And they're kind of heady, kind of academic papers, but they were intended, I think, to kind of help us, right, kind of be organized.
Do we have a question?
Marcus, we have a question
yeah, please,
online.
jump in. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Peter Kiefer has asked, how does governance enhance public trust in courts when faced with a scandal or a crisis?
Yeah. Tina, go ahead.
Were you not listening to the presentation from Alicia? We encounter that daily, and I think having that structure, we'll get into it a little bit about our communication policies a little bit later in the presentation. But thank you for that question, Peter Kiefer.
Yeah.
Really appreciate that.
No, I think that's right. And if you're organized, I mean, it may be tough to face the media or the general public with those kind of issues, and they do arise, right? But I think if you're organized, and again, there was a logical sort of approach, I think that's going to have credibility, right? Rather than this sort of, in my past, sometimes it's like a fire drill, right? And we're just, everybody's trying to jump in, but really not sure who's in charge and how you're going to handle that. So, Peter, thank you. And we do appreciate those kind of questions from the online group. I'm going to just, if I can, go over this pretty quickly. Folks are aware of the purposes of courts, right? Professor Ernie Friesen. And we're not going to review that today, but that's really good. That, to me, would set up the goalpost, right? Kind of what is the scope and the mission of the work that we do in courts, and where do we really want to spend our time and our energy and our focus, okay? We do want to mention to you this publication, A Case for Court Governance. It's a terrific piece from the state of Utah where they look at that tension between the AOCs, right, where I work now, okay, and the local courts. And that's a really important kind of a discussion there. And I think a lot of us can help with that, I think, in the work we do. And then we'll talk about principles of administration. And then, are folks familiar with these loosely coupled systems? Sort of, kind of, a few heads nodding? Okay, that's an interesting sort of a model here. I'm not going to read these principles to you, but the point here, and this came from the National Center for State Courts over many years, the point here is if you are organized and very intentional about the decision making, okay, that is going to allow you then to set really good policy for the whole enterprise, if you will, for the judges, for the staff, and maybe even the way you work with the other entities and so on. Of course, they would want the bench to be merit selected, kind of like our keynote, and then in turn, we would merit select our administrators, right? We hope, okay? But this third piece is interesting too, and I think there's a lot in the governance, if you start to read about it, about role definition, right? What is the work of the presiding judge? And how does that compare to the work of the court administrator, right? They form sort of an executive component, an executive team. And when it works, it's just magic. There's a real synergy, okay? And when it does, I see a few heads nodding. It's just terrific. And I've been so blessed to have those kind of relationships over the years. When it doesn't work, it's dysfunctional, right? It's like a bad marriage, you know? And so we're going to talk to you about that. Tina's going to actually walk you through a couple different models, productive pairs and the like. But that's really critical if you read through the principles, that relationship and trying to define that. And again, to be intentional about, where does my role stop? Maybe does the judge want to be involved in the budget decision making and whatnot, and so on. And so let's just look at a couple more of these if we can. This is, again, Roscoe Pound. He said, try to organize things so it's not so complex, right? And he always wanted sort of a 3-tiered trial court system. We don't get to set our court structures, do we, when it comes to jurisdiction and whatnot. But I think within the court administration, within your office, you can really look and see what units do we have, how are we organized when it comes to our staff meetings, and the governance, we'll talk about that pretty extensively. And then you want to use governance when it comes to resources. How many court reporters do we need? How many probation officers? Do we need to own vehicles? What about our computer systems? All that, those daily decisions, they're tough, right? And if you have good governance and you try to use a strategic plan, you're going to find that's a lot easier. Things will sort of make sense. Again, that sort of strategic alignment. So with that, Tina's going to talk to us about today, right now, okay, after all this history here, maybe how you can apply some of this and why this is really so important to our work.
So when I asked everybody how many were familiar with the core, I want to get a sense. I meant to ask you guys who's in the audience as to what your level. I mentioned there's a few people who developed this curriculum, so they've been in the court system who's been in the court system less than 5 years? Okay, we got about 8 or 9. 5 to 10 years, another 10 to 15 years. A little more on that, 15 to 20 years. You guys, why aren't you up here? 20 plus. Okay, the majority of this side of the room, and Ralph on the other side, are 20 years plus. So this is introductory kind of court governance 101. We're talking about high-level introduction for the 1 to 5, but it's also a refresher because me going through this material and looking at it, well, Marcus said, it's still relevant today, even though the curriculum's been updated from when it was written before. There's still things that are good to know, good to remember, good takeaways, good things to take back. And so for those of you who might be new in the core curriculum, this information, we're going through the sections of the curriculum, and that's, again, in your app, but it's also on the website, so you can take it back to your court. And so some of these things we won't have time to delve a little deeper in. Please feel free to use this as a resource. Okay, with that said, we talked about why it's important for that structure to have that information. We'll talk about rule of law a little bit. I'm so glad, again, our Chief Justice, who kicked off this session, our conference, she spoke about a lot of these issues that we're talking about right now. Procedural justice, judicial independence, and that concept of intersection of governance and high-performing courts. We're really not going to delve too far into it today. What I'm hoping is that at our annual conference, maybe we can get a deeper dive for those 20-plus people, 20-year-plus people. But today, we're really going to just high-level it. So Marcus said I'm going to be talking about the reality, where we are today. And it's kind of no different when even though we look backwards to Roscoe Pound and how he was concerned about public trust and confidence in the courts. That was in the 1800s. And here we are today. What are we talking about? Public trust and confidence in the courts. So it's really important that we recognize we still have a long way to go. We still have things to work on. And our state and local governments, we face that structural deficits. We actually talked about the elections. You have them at the federal level, you have them at the state level, you have them at the local level. So change in policy, change in direction, it's going to impact the work that we do. And so having that court structure helps us kind of define our lines and what we're doing, but just recognize that we're going to be changing. One of the things I love working about the courts is we have to be flexible because new laws come up all the time, right? So we usually have to look at changing procedures and having mechanisms how you do that. We have budgetary concerns. So how many people are unified states? Work for unified states, okay? We got a few hands out there. And then some of us we have a state or AOC organization. Some of us are locally funded. Any city courts? I've got a couple of city courts as well. So there's always going to be this conflict between your funding authority, or even if you're in a state where the AOC governs you, like Marcus and I are from Arizona, we've got 15 counties, so the state Supreme Court has to decide how they're going to divvy up some of those funds between the 15 counties, right? So there's going to be that conflict between those. And then I always like this process reengineering. You get maybe a new judge, a new presiding judge, a new chief justice who comes in and says, you know what, we need to change our processes. We need to re-engineer. We need to do something different. And it's like, it's just simple. Let's just change this one thing. And it's like, oh no, there's so much involved in changing that one thing. How much is it going to cost us up front? Do we have to get a consultant? Do we have to change our technology? God forbid we have to change our case management system. How many have gone through that, right? Okay. I'm glad I got the laughs because that's where I was going. It's not an easy, and as administrators, sometimes, somebody mentioned managing judges. Wait, do we have any judges in the room? Okay. No, but sometimes you have to manage that expectation as the administrator, right? Because they come in, they want to do these things, they want to change these things, and it's not as simple. I have people saying, well, I just want a button here to do this. It's like, okay, well, it might just do that for your one case, but it's going to impact so many other things. What's those unintended consequences of changing one little button? And then who's on statewide systems? So if you have a statewide system and you have, I know in Arizona for our juvenile court, we have a statewide system, and our counties, and one of the medium size, we have different needs at our local court versus some of the more rural. Sorry, Yavapai County, but they don't have the volume, right? So another county next door might not have the volume I do, so my issues are going to be a little bit different than theirs. So these are the kind of our reality and things that we need to think of, and having that court governance structure on how you make those decisions, as we mentioned, is really important. We talked about the rule of law, and when I was a baby manager growing up, it was, the rule of law sounded so formal, so scary, and it's like, what is this rule of law? And I didn't really understand the concept, but it's basically our country is governed by laws. So it's actually pretty simple when you boil it down that way. And those laws pertain to not only the public, everybody has to follow law, but it's for any entity, public or private, it's any government. So basically saying we're not a dictatorship, right? That whoever's in charge, whoever has the crown, gets to make all the decisions and tell people what to do. So under the rule of law, we have these universal principles. So it's that everybody's held accountable. Everybody should be held accountable under this, even the government, under these laws. And that they're not only clear, but they're understandable, that they're publicized, these laws, that they're stable, that the laws aren't like changed, it's like, today I feel like putting this law into effect. They're something that we can all understand and follow, and that they're protecting our fundamental rights as human beings. The process by which laws are enacted, that's fair, consistent across the board. They're administered the same. And that justice is delivered timely. What's the saying? Justice delayed is justice denied. So we want to make sure that it's not only timely, it's also being delivered by fair, impartial, neutral representatives of our communities. And I thought it was really interesting that Alicia Bannon brought up all of those disparities kind of in our judiciary and what does our bench look like versus the community. Because that's one of the things the rule of law, it's looking for. It's looking for that representation. And then the concept of procedural justice is one of my favorites. And I've never really seen this slide before and how it was presented. So as court members, we, as providing justice, people come to our court and they want justice. And how do they want justice? They want their day in court. They want to make sure that it's fair. And what I love about it is that even if they lose, if these things are met, if their voice is heard, if it's neutral, they're respected, and there's trust involved, people can walk away and not win their case as long as those are present and feel like they're okay with the outcome. Not happy about it, obviously they lost, but there's a little more sense of, no, it's okay. And so I always saw it from the viewpoint of the bench, right? That the bench lets people be heard, that the bench is neutral, they wear the black robe, they're neutral, that they're, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, they're respectful in the court towards the parties and the attorneys, and that there's a trust built. But I also like that from the viewpoint of people walking into our courthouses, right? Where does that start? It doesn't start at the bench. It starts with our staff. It starts with going through security. How are they treated when they are walking into the door? Is the security guards patting them down? I mean, are they treated with respect? Are they greeted when they walked in? Good morning. How can I help you? And all of that. So I try to tell staff how important it is that they are that window to the bench. So having that. But then this other piece where it's about the employees getting this procedural justice concept as well. And that we're treating staff, that their voices are being heard, that they're being respected, that we are, maybe punishing or disciplining or, just holding people accountable in their work product, making sure they're doing it properly. And then our employees are entrusting us as administrators, as managers. Then they go off and they do their job well, which then promotes the public trust and confidence. So you see that circle of life, right? So I love this slide. I thought this was great. And again, baking that into your court structure. How are you doing this within your court? And making sure your staff understand the importance of it to build that public trust and confidence. And I think that might be where Mark, do I keep going?
I think so.
Oh my gosh, I keep going.
We've covered so much ground. I wanted to ask you folks, do you have any questions so far or just anything you'd like to add in maybe? Jump in if you'd like. It's a lot of content. We're at 2 days so far. How's that, folks?
Day and a half. You guys are racing through it. I think it is you.
I'm going to tackle this in just a little bit. It would help us, I think, here to know, anybody here in the federal court system by chance? No? Okay. And how many of you actually work in a local court, a trial court or a local court? Okay, thank you. Most of us, it looks like. And then how about central office, AOC, or the administrative office? I see Don, just a few of us. Okay, I wanted to mention that because this section, and again, there's not time to go into this too deep, but I think if you have a chance to look at it, you'll see that this is really critical, and especially the higher up you go when you're in these executive positions, to figure out how do you work with the central office or the Supreme Court. How do you work with some of the committees and whatnot? And so the governance materials, I think, are just terrific there. And I was really pleased that they've expanded the federal court part of this so that NACOM can actually be more collaborative with the federal clerks of court and those groups. They have a lot to offer, and sometimes we do move from one sector to another. And so I think that was a big step forward you'll see in the current draft you folks have there. We're going to talk about a couple of the models, and then again, those loosely coupled systems here. So I've worked at both sides, okay? And I used to always have that tension. I could just feel that tension when it was a meeting of my local court with the state court administrator or vice versa. And I first worked back in the Illinois courts, okay? And the tension between Chicago, Cook County, and the central office it's palpable, okay? I mean, Cook County, a huge system, and that you have the state court down in Springfield. We called it Spring Patch, okay? And there would just be that, any of those meetings, and I always thought it was more personality-based. If we could just be nice, okay, and courteous, we could all work well together. But I've kind of come to, I have a deeper understanding, I think, as I've kind of made my way around the country and whatnot. And I think there is an inherent tension, okay? And the interests are maybe different, two very different perspectives. And the governance document talks about that. And it's important, once you see that, once you recognize it, okay, then you can kind of work on some strategies to kind of overcome that. So I think it's great what the document, what NACM has done. They put it right on the table, okay, and don't skirt that issue, if you will. So at the state level, okay, us AOC folks, okay, we see the big picture, right, okay, and we are working with all the other big state agencies, maybe even the governor's office, right, and because of that, you're going to tend to want a lot of standardization of business process, standardized court forms. Don't we love standard court forms? Standard procedures. All the education should be statewide. Okay, for the judges' training. It should be mandatory for the judges, right? You sort of get the idea. Big strategic plan, maybe going out 5, 6 years, maybe even 10 years and whatnot. And all the local courts, they can have some input, right? But they need to follow the plan, okay? And what I do like, AOCs will oftentimes try to find best practices in some of the local courts. And if it's really good, they may even contribute some funding and try to expand that across the state. But that's kind of the approach there. And then the management certainly needs to be what? At the state office, right? We need to do auditing, make sure you're using your money the right way and that you're following standards. And so that's, and I'm being a little glib, but that's sort of that state level perspective. Very well intended, but it's going to be big picture, right? And that's kind of, and I think that really rings true as I was reading through the material again. So locally, okay, the argument is that the local courts will be the first ones to see some of the new issues and problems. We saw that work with evictions, right, during the pandemic. It was kind of scary, right? All these moratoriums, and they kept changing the rules. And it was local judges that kind of had to figure that out, sort that out, okay? And in the last recession, we had all those folks that were defaulting on their home mortgage payments and whatnot. Local courts had to kind of deal with that housing crisis, if you will. And so a lot of the innovation, I think, over the years has come from large local courts, right? You think about the self-service center, that was a local court, sort of a model that was expanded out statewide. And I think some of the technology innovations have been incredible from local courts by necessity. And these folks would argue that we also are very connected with our local stakeholders, right? We work really well with the service providers. Think about your problem-solving courts. You work so closely with all those local agencies and those local entities. And so these two perspectives, I mean, it's kind of fascinating to me, but they're kind of two different worldviews. And in just a few minutes, Tina's going to talk to us about some ways to sort of bridge that gap. I'll just give you a preview. One of them would be judicial councils. And I do think this idea of public surveys can be really helpful to bring those two perspectives into alignment. But be aware of that, and that would be, I think, a good area for you folks to read through and talk about a little bit. And then this loosely coupled system model, this was really foreign to me when I first heard about this. What are they talking about here? Well, Mary McQueen, National Center for State Courts, had kind of picked up on this. She explained she was just in, I think, a law library and just ran into a book that was kind of talking about this. And the idea is when you work with highly specialized, highly credentialed professionals, so I'm thinking now doctors, okay, lawyers, certainly people in science, even architects, if you will, they're highly specialized and credentialed in their own field, okay? They will tend to affiliate mostly with their field, okay, their specialization. Okay, you ask a doctor, where do you work? They don't talk about they may have practice privileges at many hospitals. They will tell you about their specialization. Okay, I'm a neurosurgeon, and this is what I do, and here's where I went to school, and so on. So Mary and the National Center, they've kind of developed this model to say that that's a really much different kind of organization to manage, right? It's going to be more of a federated model, highly decentralized, right? Where the specialists are going to be on the line. They're going to be on the bench, working at the bench, and maybe even some of the administrative areas are going to be highly specialized. So if you're in that kind of a system, how do you manage that? That's tough, okay? That's really hard. And you ask any university president, and they will tell you that. You've got all these professors, and they're publishing, they're on sabbatical, they have their own grants lined up and whatnot. And likewise, if you think about the doctors and so on. And so this theory is interesting. It sort of says what you want to do is make sure you have some accountability, right, within the system with standards and good communications and whatnot. And but you have to allow people to be kind of autonomous in their work they do. The judges at the bench, they need that judicial discretion, that autonomy, and respect it. Don't fight it, but try to work with it, okay? And it also indicates you may have some unpredictable connections where you can actually leverage some of that, right, through some of the specialization. Some of these judges that we work with, they're going to come up with some really creative ideas, right, because they do see the work that happens on the bench or in the courtroom. And so the idea is to kind of build on that. You have the competing demands of these specialty courts. I keep thinking of the problem-solving courts here, right? And then others would say, no, everybody should have the same calendar. We should all operate in the same way. And so I think the challenge here for us as managers is to recognize that this is a different kind of organization to work with. And you can get a lot of credibility here if you can just give these folks resources, okay? Make sure that the judges and the other areas of specialization, they have the money they need, they have the facilities they need, and that's kind of how administration can sort of gain credibility. So an interesting read. There are several publications on this, and I wish we had a little more time, but it's an interesting sort of worldview, and it goes right to governance on how decisions are going to be made. And the argument here, I think, is to include the professionals, the judges in our case, right, include them as much as possible in the decision making. And so some courts have executive committees of judges, others may have a judicial council or a judicial executive team, and that's a way to really pull in the perspective of those folks. Any questions on that, folks? We're okay, I guess? Okay, tell us otherwise. Okay, so Tina's going to talk to us a little bit here about how you built this kind of governance structure to kind of help guide the courts.
Actually, I'm going to refer to the guide
There you go.
on how to build a structure. So what happens when we get in as a new administrator, you take a job somewhere, the structure's already there. You're not building it, right? So you're walking into something that's already kind of been built. So I just, again, trying to explain this to new leaders, people coming into jobs, just recognize that it's already there, what you have, and then use that to start conversations. And again, I'm not going to be going through all of these steps, but maybe talking about some of the things that inform how you can get yourself up to speed in order to have these conversations. And one of the biggest thing is to look at the organization culture when you first walk in. I came from California. I went from California to Arizona, and California court system versus Arizona court system, entirely different. What the stark difference was, our clerk of court in California merged with our superior court, so we were all one big happy family. Okay, that took a while, but we got there. And then I went over to Arizona, and the clerk's office is an elected official, and it's separate. So we had no control over the courtroom clerks, the court staff. And that just kind of, my mind just kind of went on the fritz a little bit when I first started saying, what do you mean the clerks are saying no to judges? I just couldn't understand that. But again, understanding that, understanding the culture, how things are set up, how things are designed, and talking to your staff and just kind of getting a feel. I took a year at juvenile court, kind of getting really to understand the lay of the land before I started implementing any policy changes, and really starting to have that dialogue with the judicial officers and what their expectations were before I did anything. So, and then Marcus talked about the conflict between managers and professionals. Yes, when you have a presiding judge or a president judge that you are clicking with, it's great. But they always say judges went to judge school, they went to law school, they are arbitrators, they are trier of fact. They didn't go to management school, right? So they don't understand the admin piece. And I usually tell people it's our responsibility to kind of guide them. And hopefully you have a judge that's open to those, well, Your Honor, if we do this, you might get in trouble, or you might end up on the front page of the paper if we do X, Y, or Z. And you're there to really kind of help them. And hopefully they're open to that understanding. But my job is to tell them enough times that hopefully they'll listen to me. And I also go on the record enough times to say, I told you so. It's documented. I said it right here. No, it's one of those things where you hopefully are able to have that dialogue. And if you can't, maybe find somebody who can. If you don't have the ability to have that dialogue, or maybe you're not connecting, find somebody else who has maybe already built a relationship or is able to have that dialogue with them. But again, that culture clash where the judges are doing judge things and the administrator are doing administration things, and how do you align those? And again, that's that shared leadership, and you looking at, okay, what are your roles and responsibilities as the presiding judge? What are my roles and responsibility as the administrator? Where do they overlap? And how do we move forward? How do we move the court forward? One of the things is establishing communication protocols. I was a courtroom clerk for many years, and one of the things I floated into different departments, and I always made sure I understood, how did the judge like to be communicated to during a hearing? Are they okay with me passing a note? Or do they want me to wait until the end of the session? Are they okay with me speaking up? Your Honor, you forgot to quash that warrant. And just getting that protocol down for all the individuals I worked with. It's no different when I got into administration. It's like, how do I communicate with the judge? Do they like emails? Do they like, just the personal drop-in? Or we set a meeting every single week to discuss issues? And I've had presiding judges where it's just like, just call me whenever something comes up, or you want me to, or just swing by, the very open door policy. And then I've also had judges that, no, I want a formal meeting, minutes taken, all of that. So just establishing those communication, how you guys communicate. But then it's not just that relationship, it's how does the court in and of itself communicate, internally and externally. And that goes to the media question that Peter asked, how do you establish public trust and confidence? Well, if you have a media policy and a crisis comes up, then you could be able to go to that structured policy that says, okay, when the media comes, how many people have public information officers? It's really handy to have them because then everything kind of gets filtered through that, and it's always kind of that structured response. You have that person, one individual who has the relationship with the media, versus it's like whoever's in charge that day answers calls, questions, the message might be different. So again, establishing a policy on how you're communicating whenever things come up. I know during the pandemic, we posted information on our website. We put out press releases about what are our courtroom doors open? Are they not open? What is the hybrid? What are the policies around? How do people get into our hearings? What does that look like? And again, that's all part of establishing these protocols and having that court governance structure. Any questions on that? The shared leadership, again, okay, Cheryl.
Cheryl, jump in, please.
Yes, please.
I'm just wondering if you're a new court administrator coming into a court, and how are you balancing, how do you move from like a very atomic situation where there's a lot of emphasis on each judge is elected, and so there's very little accountability amongst the bench, each one making their own decisions about what happens in their court that may impact the entire system. How do you effectively get them to agree that there's some accountability within their group of judges to be able to get towards a governance policy that makes the court more efficient?
So just, that's an excellent question. That could be an entire day's worth of material. And then again, that's kind of that, how do you take that court governance when it maybe is dysfunctional or that? One of the things that we've done in the past is you lean more towards statistics You lean towards what does the courtroom efficiency, what are the clearance rates, what are some of those, and you publish it amongst the bench, and then they kind of get into this competitive nature and like, oh, why are you doing better than I am? And then you can maybe start having those conversations. Well, if we did some consistency, accountability, process streamlining, then if everybody did it this way, there's still that judicial discretion and judicial independence, and you're going to have that. But at least it's one of the ways that I've seen doing that. Making sure your presiding judge, having that relationship with the presiding judge to be able to talk to them about how other judicial officers are performing, and maybe hopefully doing that. For us, I've also gone to the AOC for assistance. And Marcus can maybe talk a little bit about some other courts where the AOC's had to step in.
I think optimally you would be meeting regularly with the judges and not just bring them together when there is a real tough issue. I just think it's so terrific if you could have a weekly or probably a monthly meeting, let's say, with the bench, and then you can park some of the issues, and you can also let them know, gosh, we've got a couple of agenda items to talk about. That takes the edge off of things, I think, and it kind of depersonalizes it. I think to me, the difficult times are when it's just somebody brings something right to the presiding judge and they want a decision that afternoon, and people feel excluded. They kind of think, oh, there's favoritism and so on. So that's a great question you had. And
Do we have some comments?
Oh, please jump in.
We have an online question.
Good.
How do you manage an individual judge who wants to communicate with the media personally?
Marcus, you want to field that one?
Well, it's going to happen, certainly, right? I mean, we need to. I think we need to acknowledge that. I think one thing would be to have a policy on that, okay? And that one piece I mentioned to you out of Utah, it was Dan Becker and Justice Durham wrote that. They said it was really important for the court to speak with one voice. It was interesting, and especially at the legislature. They said if you're trying to get judges pay raises or even, let's say, some court reform or whatever, it's really tough if everybody's kind of running to their legislators locally and whatnot. So that idea of one voice. And so I think if the court had a policy on when we do get an inquiry from the media, it should be handled by our PIO or by one of the executives. I think that can help there and whatnot. And but you're still going to have situations where people. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think it's important also to create talking points.
Yeah.
If you create talking points, this is on. If you create talking points, then you at least have a basic message that everybody knows. So when you can't control the person that's going to talk to the media, at least they have a structure that they could be looking at.
Yeah, I'm not sure folks caught that, but the idea would be for the court to have some talking points. So when they deal with the media, it's structured and it's kind of, again, one message. Yeah, thank you. Great insight.
All right. So Marcus talked a little bit about judicial councils and advisory committees. At our AOC, we have our judicial council, and it's made up with a lot of the trial court judicial leadership within the state of Arizona. And they deal with statewide issues. And so there can be committees on a variety of different topics. The Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice will appoint judges. And then again, it goes to that statewide kind of overarching, what are we doing? What are we addressing? How are we addressing things within the state level? Marcus, you want to share a little bit more on just kind of how these committees and how they work?
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, this was a huge development. I would say the 70s and the 80s, the idea that there would be these councils. Typically, they'll also involve some folks from the community, and I just love it. Like we had one person, I think, from the executive director from United Way, but not just judges and lawyers, but other folks that would have an interest, and ideally, maybe even some litigants. Wouldn't that be interesting? The one thing to be aware of is some are just advisory. I say just, okay? But it's really important as staff to know that they can vote and but typically the decision then will come from the Chief Justice, right? And others, I think California has moved to this, they are actually making decisions about how the money would be divided up and the priorities, let's say, for the technology system. So The National Center, I think, does keep an inventory of those different, and it's really important. If you're working in those systems, I think it's really important to know how strong is my judicial counsel, you know? And I think as administrators, if you get a chance to serve on one of these or one of the work groups, grab that opportunity, because for me, it's always been really gratifying. It's a whole sort of another world, and it's really worthwhile. And you can help shape, the decision, or at least the thinking, I think. So,
I'm glad Marcus brought up the National Center for State Courts. If you type in state court organizations, you can see a compilation of how each state is structured. The majority of them. I don't think all states are on there, but it talks about if it is unified, it talks about what their authority is, it talks about the different levels of all the different courts. And I think it's fascinating information for those who like that kind of stuff. So I want to point you to that direction. Let's see. And then we talked about productive pairs already. We talked about the loosely coupled organization. We talked about shared leadership. So then there's that piece of productive pairs. So that's when the judge and your presiding judge and the administrator are working in conjunction. So they have their two roles, but there's that overlap. And it's the sweet spot. It's when you guys are communicating well, you have the same vision for the court, and it's a great place to be. And again, having that structure, when a new judge comes on and trying to explain to them their roles and responsibilities, that's really helpful, is if you're trying to bring somebody on board. If somebody's already there and you're coming on board, it's also helpful for you to know kind of what you should be doing, and then trying to articulate that to the person who might have been there for a few years. A great resource for this is the NAPCO, which stands for the National Association of Presiding Judges and Court Executive Officers. Shortened down to NAPCO. So they have this paper out on their website, and it is it's basically principles, roles, and responsibilities, and it's a side-by-side comparison on whatever different issue, case flow. What is the presiding judge's role? What is the court administrator role? And while I had this thought, I wanted to take this to when I had a new presiding judge, I'm like, I'm gonna take this to him and I'm gonna show him. I never ended up doing that, but I did familiarize myself with it, and so I was able to have those conversations with him. Because part of me wanted to just like slip it under the door, read this, please, and that never works. So again, this is a tool for you, and it's not on our website, but we'll see if I can get it posted for you guys. It's the acronym NAPCO, the number 4 courtleaders.org. I think it's plural, court leaders. Anyway, so it's a great resource for you to use that. And then we've got a little bit of time left for Marcus to kind of wrap us up.
Thank you. And this is that part I was hoping you might take back home with you. So do think about this, right? I mean, it's great to learn about all the theory and whatnot, but what can we do as a practical matter? And so the guide is actually saying that you should actually develop a series of questions, and then think about, you could either do a survey at your home court, like a little survey monkey, we all use that, right? Or maybe even do some interviews, right? So do think about this, and it'd be a great project to work with your presiding judge and maybe a small team, right? And some of the questions they would suggest, okay, and you can read through all this, but do we have the right people involved when it comes to governance, right? So who's on our executive committee? Who's on the bench meeting agenda there? Do we need to involve some outside people as well from the community and so on? Are the roles and responsibility of the governance committee clear, okay? Is it advisory, that whole thing, or is it going to make decisions about calendar assignments and case management? And so that's a great question. How is the information being collected for that group, okay? Does everything come from the court administrator, or do you have some way to feed information in, maybe not just from the judges, but think about the JAs and the court reporters? Is there some way to get some input from those folks, right? So I thought that was terrific. And when you have a governance meeting, I love this, is it really effective? Okay, is it kind of charades? Are people just being nice with each other, or are you really delving in, kind of what Cheryl was saying, if you have a really tough issue? And so you got to maybe think about it, and the evaluation can help with that, okay, to kind of, in a thoughtful way, kind of do an evaluation. And then they also say you should look externally, try to get some stakeholders, get a little input to ask them. And I could sort of picture people over at the county board maybe, or maybe the sheriff's department, just ask them, Do you understand how decisions are made in the court? Do you understand about the impact, and how's that affecting you folks? Are we communicating? I know some courts now have fancy newsletters or blogs. Some have PIOs. Some just do really hardcore memos over to the other agencies, but this would be a chance to kind of think about that and whatnot, and maybe see if you can expand the collaboration. So I think it's a great opportunity, and I don't think it has to be a huge lift. The timing is kind of tricky. I think you'd have to decide, you want to wait to have a new presiding judge, or is it something that your judges, would be comfortable right now? So do think about that. And I want to ask, has anybody done some of that kind of work? I know there's a lot of work in the high performance court framework where they were trying to look at organizational culture and the like. Could you jump in, please? Yeah, let's get a microphone. It's so interesting. And go ahead, please.
The NCSC helped us. NCSC helped us set up an executive committee 4 or 5 years ago. So they meet regularly, they meet monthly, and talk about a lot of these issues. The administrators on the committee, we have hearings referees on the committee. So it's a broad range. It's a broad group of people. We have 38 judges, so there's a representative that has a group that they report back to, which is good.
Yeah, and you think it's really served you well?
It's helped. It's definitely helped, to communicate out. We have a lot of new judges, so we're sort of trying to figure out how does that work. We have 38 judges, 28 who've been on the bench less than 6 years.
Wow.
So we're trying to figure out how do we help them.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you for sharing. And that's a large court then, and so they're onboarding, but also helping with the culture. And they created what did you call it, an executive, judicial executive committee? So. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Cheryl, please.
We also had the National Center come in recently and implemented a new governance structure just January 1st. We also, can't remember what I said. I can't say it again. But we also had the National Center come in and give some consulting to us. So we just implemented a very different governance model January 1st, and we're still in the pains of figuring that out together.
And that's an honest administrator speaking, okay? But we would like to follow up on that, and I think at least you're trying something, right? And you'll find out, and then you can make adjustments along the way. Cheryl, thanks for sharing. Yeah, jump in, please.
We struggle with this in developing this, and I think maturing our governance. But one of the things that's really helped is working with our executive branch, and they had a need, which was better information on budget recommendations from the individual courts. By giving our court's executive committee authority to review and provide recommendations, that helps strengthen the governance internally, but also benefits the executive branch. So working with them, we've been able to create a better system.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thank you. Thanks for sharing. And folks, I'm really mindful of the time. I hear them clapping across the way, right? So we're gonna leave you with this leadership proposition, okay? And our point is, I think, and Tina, as we've kind of put this together, this is not just theory, it's not academic. We hope you can actually take some of this back locally with the idea that you are part of that executive management team, right? And maybe try to include some of your other managers too. You're not alone with all this, right? And but that it's really going to work best if you can formalize kind of what we just heard here. If you can kind of take a real intentional look at the structures, be willing to kind of shake it up a little bit, try it, and then you can evaluate it, right? There's that dimension of time. You could even promise the bench, we're going to try this new structure and we'll look at it next year to make sure it's serving us well. And so with that, let me check with Tina. Just anything more you'd like to add, Tina, please?
No, I really appreciate your attendance. This has been great. You guys have been awesome, and thank you for online presenting, asking your questions. And if you have any questions for us, feel free to reach out. Marcus and I are always available. Next slide or info. Or you can chat with us in the app. And that's it. If you're interested in the core, make sure you do your online structured response.
And Tina likes really contentious questions, okay? So if you can
I love
think of
it when
anything
Marcus does that to me.
really tough, she's going to help with that. No, you folks have been fabulous, and yeah, we'll hang around a little bit if we want to talk. And is there anything else? I guess they're asking you folks to do the survey if you can. That helps for planning. And
Yes.
Anything else? Go ahead, please.
Yes, we'd like to first thank Tina and Marcus for hosting this session for us. If you join us and give them a round of applause.
Thank you.
We'd like to thank those of you that are live streaming. Please make sure you go into the app and rate the session, the speakers as well as the session. All of that is in the app. And of course, all the documents are there, the PowerPoint. So we hope that you'll go in there and, get through all that stuff, okay? We want to thank you all for this session and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.